Good afternoon. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to this event. Thank you for joining us today. I am Sonia Carley. I am the faculty co-director of the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy and a presidential distinguished professor here at the University of Pennsylvania. We are so pleased today to have U.S. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse for a grand finale event of Energy Week. And we have had so many amazing events this week, over 24 across campus. But this is a particularly special one. In a few minutes, the senator will speak to us about his work surrounding climate and energy policy. But first, I would like to introduce Michael Mann, who will then introduce the senator. So like the senator, Michael Mann doesn't need much of an introduction, but I will still introduce him anyway and just hit on a few keynotes. Michael Mann is a presidential distinguished professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Science here at the University of Pennsylvania, with a secondary appointment in the Annenberg School for Communication. He is also the director of the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media, and is a faculty fellow of the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy. His research focuses on climate science and climate change, and he has written many books, many of which have topped charts all across the country and world. And his CV lists many amazing awards and accolades, and I'll just share a few highlights. Michael received the Friend of the Planet Award from the National Center for Science Education, the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement, and the Climate Communication Prize from the American Geophysical Union. Scientific American once listed him as one of the 50 leading visionaries in science and technology, and Bloomberg News put him on their list of the 50 most influential people. And in 2020, he was elected as a fellow of the National Academy of Sciences. And now let's hear from Michael. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Sonia, for those very kind words. I am the only thing here standing between you and Sheldon Whitehouse, and so I'll try to be brief with my comments. But I do want to say it is distinctly my pleasure to introduce my friend, my hero, the great Senator of Rhode Island, Sheldon Whitehouse. It's truly an honor to share the podium with him. I first met Sheldon 11 years ago at his office in the Hart Senate building. Frustrated by the lack of meaningful action on climate in the US Congress, he had recently begun giving a series of time to wake up speeches on the Senate floor. And he had been reaching out to climate scientists like myself to make sure that he was up on the latest science, characteristic of the true diligence that is his hallmark. Since then, I've had the opportunity to interact with him on numerous occasions, both formally and informally, in our common effort to bring attention to the climate crisis. I guess part of the kinship that I feel with Sheldon is that we are both fighters. Sheldon doesn't suffer bullies, and he's devoted his career fighting for a better world, whether it be in the political realm, the scientific realm, or the environmental realm. He was appointed by Bill Clinton as U.S. Attorney for Rhode Island in 1994 and went on to become Attorney General of Rhode Island in 1999, where he took the fight to polluters, and he would continue to do so. He's shown a tenacity in fighting for fairness, equality, a livable planet. In other words, for us, that in my view is unmatched in the entirety of our government today. And what I really love is that he brings his formidable prosecutorial acumen to these battles. He's been fighting, leading the fight against dark money and court capture, an issue that has come to the very fore of our public discourse over the last year in the wake of increasingly controversial Supreme Court decisions that seem to prioritize the will of powerful vested interests above the public good, with huge looming implications potentially for climate action here in the US. And by looming, I mean next week. Let me sound a more personal note here. Sheldon has been a true friend. A few years ago, he was kind enough to take time out of his busy DC schedule to attend an honors ceremony of the American Geophysical Union, where I was receiving an award. And when I won my recent defamation case in the DC Superior Court, the first person I got a phone call wasn't my wife, it wasn't my father, it was Sheldon. On the other hand, Sheldon has publicly called me a weasel. Actually, in the kindest possible way. In fact, let me quote him specifically from his recent book, The Scheme, which is about the capture of our courts by plutocrat-fueled dark money. When they, polluters, went after Michael Mann, they grabbed a ferret by the teeth, and they probably now wish they'd left him alone. Now, if I was actually a ferret, I think I'd be Ferret Bueller, but that's another conversation. It's another. I've also had the pleasure of getting to know members of Sheldon's family, including his daughter, Molly, who lives in the area and is right here in the front row. She's the founding director of an investment firm here in Philly, got her master's degree at Penn back in 2018 with a focus on sustainable development. And she was active here at Penn on climate matters when she was a student here. So the apple didn't fall too far from the tree. And now there's another seedling. I was delighted to learn just a month ago that Molly gave birth to a baby boy, making Sheldon now the proud grandfather, I think, of two. One of the things I admire most about the senator, as I alluded to earlier, is his tenacity, including his tenacity on climate change. During his time on the Hill, he delivered nearly 300 time to wake up speeches where he highlighted the scientific consensus behind human-caused climate change and the urgency of the needed action. But beyond these speeches, the senator has consistently pushed for policies aimed at reducing carbon emissions and addressing the impacts of climate change. He has also been at the center of bipartisan efforts to pass laws overhauling federal education policy, rebuilding our nation's infrastructure, reforming the criminal and juvenile justice systems, protecting Americans from toxic chemicals in everyday products, and addressing the ocean pollution crisis. In fact, some years ago, I attended a conference that Sheldon was hosting up in Providence, Rhode Island on the ocean crisis. And in fact, one of the keynote speakers was his colleague, Lisa Murkowski, a Republican, and they were working together. And Sheldon sort of is a great example of how it's still possible to find some bipartisan cooperation in our government today. Anyhow, it sometimes feels like he's a lone voice in the wilderness, fighting for us and our planet. And I thank him from the bottom of my heart for doing so. And so now, with no further ado, the great Sheldon Whitehouse.
Well, my day is complete. I can go home now. I've been called a hero by Michael Mann, who is one of my heroes. And I've been described as tenacious by a man who is legendary for his tenacity. So this is a big day for me. I'll talk about climate and begin by saying that the pathway to climate safety is getting very, very narrow. We have wasted so many opportunities and so much time. There is a summary of all of the peer-reviewed projections that have been made about where we go on climate, 1,200 of them. 1,200 of them. And of the ones that are still viable, we haven't given up the time that we needed to do things. Of the 1,200, of the ones that are still viable, there are only 11 scenarios that actually get us back under 1.5 degrees. And they all either touch or exceed 1.5 degrees before we have to claw our way back down. So we are really in a lot of trouble. We are in the rumble strip, having left the safety highway. And it's really important that we fight our way back. It's also really important that we recognize, as we fight our way back, that there is very persistent and very badly behaved opposition to forging a pathway to climate safety. The fossil fuel industry cares not a whit for climate safety, and they maintain an enormous apparatus to try to dissuade, deter, discourage, deflect, and destroy our climate efforts. Not too recently, off the coast of Rhode Island, a Senate staffer, legendary for his antipathy to climate legislation, who was the lead anti-climate staffer for Senator Jim Inhofe, famously of the snowball, and the most rampant climate denier of all the Republican climate deniers. That individual was off the coast of Rhode Island in a boat purporting to be interested in the welfare of whales, when in fact what he was interested in was trying to figure out a way to turn public concern for whales into opposition to offshore wind, which for states like Rhode Island is pretty much the only way we can get to net zero. So that sort of is in the category of a ineffectual, stupid, and annoying stunt. It actually gets much more dangerous than that. You see the United States Chamber of Commerce, which is the biggest lobbying entity in the United States of America. Its lobbying clout, it's 3x number 2. That's how big it is on the lobbying front. And it doesn't just lobby, it goes into regulatory proceedings and offers comments. It goes into lawsuits and litigates, and it comes to Congress with money and influences politics. And Senator Schatz of Hawaii and I just had a press conference yesterday to call them out for a completely fake effort that they began about 4 years ago in their supposed pivot towards a better climate posture, to creating a climate action task force that had no interest in climate, produced no action, and is no, if it ever was a task force, is not any longer. So they are a very, very powerful force to have to contend with, and they're just one of many. We just saw their success in the Securities and Exchange Commission rule about climate disclosure, which left out 2 pretty significant things. One is scope 3 emissions, the emissions you're responsible for when your product gets burned, but you're not burning it yourself, fossil fuel industry specific, basically. They totally passed on that. And then in the Budget Committee, which I chair, we've had over and over again hearings about where this leads, that there are serious economic disruptions ahead from climate. The 2008, the mortgage meltdown and the way that clobbered the American economy is ready to happen again, for instance, because of coastal property values crashing. And you see the early spin of that happening in Florida right now. Insurance costs are skyrocketing. Insurance companies are going out of business or leaving the state. They've propped up a more or less fake public insurance company to try to provide nominal coverage in the meantime. But you get what they're now planning for, which is a Cat 6 hurricane. They're building a new category for it. And this company completely collapses. It has nowhere near the reserves to meet that need. So at that point, you can't get insurance, so you can't get a mortgage. So if you're trying to sell your property to somebody, you're left only with cash buyers, which isn't very many folks. So there's your property values crash. And that's not me predicting it. That's the Freddie Mac, the big US-backed mortgage company. So this thing can get really, really, really serious in a hurry. And the SEC ignored all of those systemic economic risks. It just looked at the kind of immediate risks to a company of having to make the transition. So it was really unfortunate, and it was particularly unfortunate as I think they did so because they were either beguiled or threatened by a campaign run by the fossil fuel industry to discredit ESG policies. The anti-ESG woke capitalism thing is, in my view, a fake. It is essentially a Broadway theatrical production that escaped the theater and ran out into the streets with actors, with scripts, with directors, with producers, the whole thing a complete fake, designed to create the illusion that there is a movement against ESG, when in fact, if you drill in, you almost inevitably find it's never about the G, it's never about the S, it's always about the E, and the E is always fossil fuel. So it's a self-identification process of who's behind it. So it's been really discouraging to see the SEC cave to A, pressure, and B, pressure from a essentially fake operation. We are not going to get anywhere legislatively in this Congress. Speaker Johnson is essentially the factotum of the fossil fuel industry. And he's made it clear that their entire effort is to undo fossil fuel. His predecessor, when they were negotiating over the debt limit, their debt limit solution was, I'm making up the numbers right now because I don't have them ready to mind, but let's say it was a 190-page bill. 160 pages of it were handouts to fossil fuel. Give you an idea of just how very much in tow they are in the House. So my focus has instead been on what more President Biden and his administration can do to get climate right while we have the tools at our disposal. And it's a good news, bad news story. The good news is that they've agreed to set up a methane task force. They have set up the methane task force. They announced it last June. And it's really important to plug methane, particularly now that we can find methane leaks by satellite. If you can find methane leaks by satellite, why are you not sending the equivalent of a fire truck full of lawyers to the leak to plug it that day as quickly as you possibly can? And they're getting around to doing that. They have set it up. There are fairly significant issues about the diligence and the determination and the rapidity with which this methane task force is operating. So we are looking into it, but the good news is the notion of a methane task force exists, and if it's well executed, it can make a really, really big difference on a very dangerous greenhouse gas. In the short term, 80 times as dangerous as carbon dioxide. So still a fair amount of work to be done, but a start, a foothold. The second thing, again, good news, bad news, social cost of carbon. The social cost of carbon is basically an internal carbon price. I've tried for years to get a proper national internal carbon price for the whole country and economy-wide carbon price. And the fossil fuel guys in the chamber have crushed me every single time. But the Biden administration set up an internal social cost of carbon. So if you go to Microsoft and you're making planning decisions within that corporation and many others, in the internal decision-making process, they insist that their different divisions bake in a social cost of carbon so that they know what the emissions effect of their internal decision-making is. This is the Biden administration doing what leadership corporations have been doing for a long time. It is a real social cost of carbon. It is $190 per ton. That is serious. And Shalanda Young, who may be the most capable, competent, and wonderful person in all of Washington politics, who is the director of the Office of Management and Budget, and her OIRA sidekick, Ricky Revesz, who is a climate scientist and a climate economist and knows his stuff, have given direction to all executive agencies. Thou shalt comply with the $190, not that one specific, thou shalt do carbon internal pricing, social cost of carbon. And by the way, here's one that's already been run through the Administrative Procedures Act at $190. So both of those things are wonderful. And now the question is, will the executive agencies actually accomplish this? Like the methane task force, it is an implementation question, and we need to ride herd on them. So I'm doing that. The last good news, bad news is that, unfortunately, the good news comes from the other side of the Atlantic, and that is that the European Union, and joined now by the United Kingdom in a very important decision by the UK, has set up a carbon border tariff. So if you're manufacturing goods somewhere where the carbon load of your manufacture is worse than in the EU, you're going to have to pay a tariff to equal that up so that there is an unfair economic advantage for polluting, and it's to eliminate what is called in the trade leakage of carbon emissions from one economy to another. And it's called the CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and I've been tracking it since its inception and being as encouraging as I possibly can be. And we're now at the stage, now that it is real, it has passed into law, companies are starting to get notices. There'll actually be bills starting in 2026, and it'll grow through 2034, I think. That's the planning horizon of American companies, and we need to have that in our planning horizon in Congress as well. There's bipartisan work taking place on this, which is a good thing. The fossil fuel industry obviously is pushing back as hard as it can, but there's some inevitability, if you will, if you're looking at industries like cement, steel, aluminum, chemical, pharmaceutical, having to pay tariffs. They're not going to like that. And they're going to come into their member of Congress and they're going to say, what the hell? Why am I having to pay these tariffs? And the member of Congress is going to have to say, oh, that's so we can keep it free for the oil industry to pollute. Not necessarily the best argument to companies that may be actually trying to clean up their own act themselves and spending money on emissions reduction. So it gives us some political leverage that this is happening. And I'm now arguing very hard for the Biden administration to take a much more positive way of addressing the CBAM. Join the party. And I've got a bill to do that. So I've even offered the hard proposal. They tried to divert away from it, and I have killed that diversion effort. And now they're going to have to face up to the fact CBAM is coming, and we need a carbon border price in order to qualify with CBAM, or else we're going to be tariffed. And that, I think, you put those three things together, you put a really robust task force that is knocking down methane emissions as soon as satellites spot them. And by the way, once we get off the bar stool, we can preach temperance to the rest of the world about methane emissions. We can go even to Azerbaijan for the next COP and say, here's something we can agree to. We're going to spot the damn methane leaks and we're going to shut them down. But you can't preach temperance from a bar stool, so we've got to clean up our own act first. It could be a really big deal. The social cost of carbon is the entry point for carbon pricing, and considering that we're a $6 trillion budget, I think we just went to $7.2 trillion budget in the president's latest filing. That's a lot of money, and that's a big price signal into the markets. And then load up CBAM, and suddenly you've got three really good things going on, and a pathway to climate safety finally begins to emerge. I'll close by complimenting Mike on, among his many aspects of tenacity, fighting the basic sort of fossil fuel mouthpieces who were trying to and did defame him, and successfully doing it. And for those of you who are concerned about the state of our politics and the extent to which bullying and lies have taken a really dominant role in our political debate, consider how helpful honest courtrooms have been. In addition to Mike being able to win his suit and get $1 million from one of these scoundrels, the moms whose kids were murdered at Sandy Hook in Connecticut were able to shut up Eric Jones and his horrible InfoWars operation, which was pretending that they had faked their children's murder. They were never going to drown him out. He was always going to have the bullying advantage of them until they got him into an honest courtroom and they shut him down. Little company making something really tedious, an election machine, Dominion, was cast by Fox News as an international villain stealing an election in the United States of America. You're never going to drown out Fox News. They are the megaphone of the planet. But get them into an honest courtroom, boom, $800 million they got to pay, and there's more coming. And then look at Jean Carroll, who was always going to be bullied by Donald Trump, always going to be called out by him, always going to be mocked and humiliated by him, until she got him into an honest courtroom. And now he has to write big checks to her. So as creepy as things very often look, over and over again, honest courtrooms have shut down the lying and the bullying and brought justice to underdogs. So I'll say, as a lawyer, I'll say a kind word for honest courtrooms. Thanks very much.
Thank you for those comments. Very insightful and helpful and inspiring. I'll just tell the audience that I actually have your questions in my hand. We asked you to submit your questions when you RSVP'd for this event. So I have the pleasure of getting to ask these questions to the senator today. And I'm going to begin with a question about CBAM, where more or less where you left off. And I know that this is very near and dear to your heart. You've been a champion in Congress. And you have a proposal, the Clean Competition Act.
Yes.
I'm hoping that you could just tell us a little bit more about it.
Yep.
And then secondarily, discuss some of the challenges and the opportunities with it, specifically with US manufacturing and those manufacturers that have very large global supply chains.
The bill does something very basic, and it has a sidecar piece to it. The basic thing that it does is to charge a tariff on goods imported to the United States, where Treasury and EPA working together can demonstrate that the carbon footprint of the product that's coming in is measurably worse than the carbon footprint of the product made here in the United States. And the tariff trues up for that difference. It also sends an extremely powerful price signal out into the world that you got to clean up. So it's the best thing we can do in terms of affecting international compliance with carbon goals. Interestingly, we've been working with the group that has been backstopping the EU as it has prepared its CBAM. It's a think tank called Bruegel. It's based in Brussels. They're very good. And their work suggests that even if we don't pass my bill, and even if we do have to pay those tariffs, and there is obviously some economic headwind on our economy from our exports having to be tariffed, that the difference between China's tariff and our tariff is so significant because China's current levels of pollution are so much greater that it actually moves manufacturing and supply chain to the United States in numbers that completely offset any tariff. So it is actually net a huge economic tailwind pushing America forward. So it's going to be hard for people to say, no, we want to end all of that when we're actually winning from it. And then that focuses people back on the, okay, given that, why the hell are we paying tariffs? Oh yeah, so polluters can pollute for free. Not a great argument. So it puts all that in quite a good place. The EU folks, I think, are highly unlikely to let us out of paying those tariffs unless we have a proper internal price on carbon. And while they haven't officially signed off on it, we've been working with them all along. And I believe that they and WTO are comfortable with our resolution, which is a very fair one, which is that if you are in an industry that is a polluting industry and is one of the ones covered by the CBAM, and if you are in the bottom half of that industry in terms of your carbon footprint, then you pay the tariff internally, a carbon price within the United States. But the top performing half of the industry does not. So it sends a very powerful signal into the worst polluting segment of an industry. And it also disproves beyond argument that you can make the improvements to get out from under the price because half your industry already did. It ain't that hard. And with any luck, as industries improve, the level climbs and we move rapidly upwards as it becomes worse and worse to be at the very bottom. So that's what the bill does. It creates the internal price on carbon and the international tariff.
Thank you. I'd like to stick on the same theme of U.S. manufacturing as well as supply chains, and specifically move us a little bit into the topic of inflation. So the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, which I'll come back to in a minute, is one of the major purposes is to expand U.S. manufacturing, domestic manufacturing, and it will take several years, of course, until some of this kind of robust onshore manufacturing materializes. But in the meantime, we've observed many disruptions to our supply chain. Including due to the pandemic, due to the war in Ukraine, protectionist policies against China, and this is all combined with growing demand for energy within the United States. All of these have created shortages in materials in the clean energy sector, as well as other sectors. So the question here is, will CBAM exacerbate these inflationary pressures in clean energy materials and thereby make clean energy less competitive than fossil fuel alternatives?
I think it's obvious that in the short run, the Inflation Reduction Act's clean energy components have really boosted production demand. And that puts pressure on supply chains and that drives up price. That is to me, very welcome short-term market signal to those supply chains to say, make more, because we're going to need more wind turbine blades. We're going to need more generators. We're going to need more of the equipment that will help move us through this transition. You see it trying to buy heat pumps right now. But that's in a market economy, you want that market signal out there so that people boost their production out the supply chain. And that's temporary. What's permanent is climate inflation. There may be occasional moments of relief, but if you look around at family expenses, a lot of the inflation that people are seeing can be explained by climate. You can see it in food prices that climb as climate problems interfere with food production. An article 2 days ago about banana costs are going to go up because of climate. You see it with anything that's shipped. If you go look off the Panama Canal, traffic is backed up, and it's expensive when traffic backs up, and it's backed up because climate change has driven water levels down so that they're not able to put as much shipping through. That's a price that American consumers pay. It's directly related to climate. You look at the Florida insurance market, which is now about 4 times what it was just a few years ago. If you can buy property insurance at all, which is increasingly a challenge, that is 100% climate related. So in area after area that climate is having effects that will come home to family pocketbooks. And it's really important that we talk about it in those terms so people understand this is not about polar bears. This is not about, just making nice by having solar panels on your roof. This is about how families get by. And it's particularly bad if we get into one of these climate crises that we've been having extremely powerful testimony on in the budget committee, where the whole economy takes a 2008 style dive because of one of these multiple risks. And we've got really 4 major risks, and they could all happen. And they could all happen at once. So we're really playing in a very dangerous, economic thin ice right now, in addition to the steady drag of climate inflation. And that's what I've tried to devote the budget committee to paying attention to. Drive some of my colleagues crazy.
Last question on CBAM specifically. The question is protectionism the way to ensure economic development? And can CBAM start a trade war with Europe or others?
CBAM actually resets a neutral platform. If we were going to start a trade war with Europe, the IRA would have done it. Because that really was direct competitive. We're going to subsidize our industries. That'll make them able to compete more effectively against your industries. Ha ha, we win, you lose. And when I went to the COP in Egypt, it was the buzz of the place. And Europeans were really pretty damned angry at that point. And what the Senate delegation said to them is, tough bounce. Too bad. Sorry you don't like it. Catch up. Meet us or beat us. Which is interesting because now that we're whining a little bit about the oncoming CBAM, we've given them the perfect script to us to say, shut up, quit complaining, meet us or beat us. And now we have a win on both sides. We have the carbon pricing side win of everybody matching there. And we have the, as President von der Leyen said in the EU, they actually are developing policies to catch up so that you then get back into a reset base in which climate is real and is a part of the economic calculus of the world, as opposed to an artificial base in which polluting for free is the baseline. And of course, we've seen where that leads us.
I'm going to turn us next to discussing the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the CHIPS Act. And in fact, we had an event earlier this week for Energy Week with Anna Siefken, who's a deputy director at the DOE,
Yep.
and she called them her 3 best friends. I'm sure many of you were in the audience. I will never think about these 3 laws the same. So let's talk about the 3 best friends,
Yep.
if you share them as best friends as well. Could you talk to us a little bit about how how the implementation is going specifically for all 3, and how are Congress and other governmental partners ensuring specifically the sustainability of these efforts?
Yeah, I would say it's going pretty well. I think that the CHIPS Act was a bit new. And so industry wasn't particularly adapted to the input from the government. But because it was so narrowly focused in a few industries and it was so big for them, they've adapted very quickly. And I think the take-up is happening very rapidly, inhibited to an extent, I think, by just the supply chain issues, which, again, quality problem to have. The big bipartisan infrastructure bill went through very well-known existing funnels and out into programs that are pre-existing and ready to go. So adoption there has been terrific and has gone quite smoothly. The IRA, they've had to take John Podesta, who used to be chief of staff to the White House, to the president, and bring him back to make sure that they were implementing it well. He knows his way around government. He and his sidekick, Ali Zaidi, have, I think, been working really hard to get it done. Treasury has been working very hard to design the tax credits properly. We left them some very difficult questions that they had to solve in the regulatory process. So I really admire what Janet Yellen and her team have done to land those regs in a good place where it wasn't clear we could get it defined specifically in the law. We just had to leave them room to make a good or a bad decision, and they've made, I think, good decisions. I think Janet Yellen is our best climate ally in the entire Biden administration. She's quiet about it, but she's really been great. So I think that's going pretty well. I'd say we're definitely in B plus A minus range on the IRA, and considering how much of that was new and how big it was, that was not an easy load to move forward. So the Biden administration really leaned in hard to getting that done, and I love it. I'm on the finance committee, and it was our finance committee climate work that basically got picked up and dropped into the IRA, and so I have a lot of ownership in that work. And then the methane fee, which is the first time we've actually put a penalty on a greenhouse gas, was my bill from the Environment Public Works Committee that Chairman Carper, who has a very good relationship with Joe Manchin, was able to get Manchinized somewhat, but not so badly that it's not effective. And so that's a big part of the bill. And it'll be interesting to see that roll out, because we're really in the workup for that right now at EPA.
That's great. So Ira, Bill, and Chips are your best friends as well.
They're all best friends.
They're all
They're best friends. If you care about climate, there's just no doubt, though, that the IRA is the very, very big best friend. It's the big ox pulling the plow.
Arguably the biggest piece of climate legislation that's ever been passed, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, on the one hand, yes, and that's great. On the other hand, super low bar, because we've never passed a serious piece of climate
Fair.
legislation.
Fair. Okay, big question, big open-ended question. What is your outlook for the future of climate policy, and what priorities should Congress have in this space, and what will it take to achieve these priorities?
I think that Congress is a place where it's a lot easier to stop things than to move things. And the fossil fuel industry has been around Congress for a long time. It basically exists in two spaces. It produces a product and it manages Congress. And it has for a long time, because it's needed all sorts of protections from tax laws and from pollution laws, and it's needed to work with the government to get access to public lands to drill on. And they are highly attuned to getting their will in Congress, and have been for a very, very, very long time. So it is a mature and experienced lobbying and manipulation piece of machinery. And they also know that they're not uniformly loved, so they've developed a very robust apparatus of intermediary entities to make it look like it's not them. There are probably 200 different front groups that they operate at any given time. So we've got a real battle to. The good news is we know how to do this. You put a price on carbon. It's not complicated. It's quite easy to do. And it's totally consistent with economic theory 101. Cripes, you go find Milton Friedman and he'll tell you that this is how an economy is supposed to work in a market economy. It's only the fossil fuel industry and Republicans around the fossil fuel industry who are trying to rewrite the basic laws of economics to protect the industry. So the solution is right there in front of us. And the obstacle has been this apparatus of machinery and the public concern that it has falsely created, and how we deal with that. And I think it's really important as we move forward for President Biden and his bully pulpit to be a lot more candid about why we are where we are on climate. I'll close with one last little story. I got elected in 2006. I got sworn in by Dick Cheney in January of 2007, and I spent 3 years in the Senate, during which climate change was a completely bipartisan issue. We had 3 different bills kicking around in the Senate that were all bipartisan, and they weren't these little nibbly bills about maybe like doing a report that relates to climate somehow and doesn't have any emissions effect. These were like real deal bills that would have changed emissions trajectory. And we had John McCain running for president as a Republican with a completely legit climate platform. That was what you want Congress to look like on a big issue like this. That all dropped dead in January of 2010. And you can point exactly to the date when it all dropped dead. And not coincidentally, it was the date of the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court that let unlimited amounts of money flow into politics. Guess who has unlimited amounts of money to put into politics? And let them flow it in secretly because they never cleaned up the part of their decision where they said dark money is corrupting. So there have been billions and billions of fossil fuel dark money dollars flowing into our politics, and we simply have to cure that. By the way, it's a rot that we have to take out of our democracy, whether or not climate is the issue. So those two things go hand in hand. And if we can clean up the dark money rot, we can let people see who's behind this stuff, then we can move very rapidly to a very easy to administer and very powerful and effective means of turning off the carbon emission spigot.
On the same thread of partisanship as well as sustainability of policies, if there is a change in administration next year, what features of the current environmental and climate agenda will remain?
Everything that has been passed, we will fight like demons to defend in the Senate. And even if we lose our Senate majority, we're not going to go down to 40. The Republicans are going to have a 60-vote majority. So we can play very active defense. The administration, however, has to make a lot of these programs work. So Trump doesn't necessarily have to undo the law. He just tells his people, stop obeying the law. Don't do this. Or slow walk it the way they slow walked their offshore wind stuff. So it gets pretty dangerous. And on the general theory that you observe around the world that we've known for decades, that autocracy and corruption go hand in hand, you know, here's a guy who features all of the signals of autocracy, and here's the corrupting industry. They're a perfect match for each other, and it's not going to be pretty. On that happy note.
Yeah. I didn't want to say it, but yeah, I was going to say it.
No, I mean, it's real. We're playing with live ammunition here in our politics right now, and it's not just something to observe. It is going to affect people's lives very dramatically.
I have another question about IRA. The IRA does not limit subsidies for carbon capture and storage for hard to decarbonize industries and provides subsidies for enhanced oil recovery. In your view, what can be done to minimize the risks that these subsidies go to increase the production of fossil fuels? And should these subsidies be awarded to facilities that produce products that are going to be exported, such as to coal to Asia?
Yeah. As I recall, I don't remember the exact language, but it was written in such a way that enhanced oil recovery is disfavored as a use. And we have provided added tax benefit for just extraction out of the regular air rather than out of a smokestack. It's important that we be able to do just direct air capture as well as smokestack recovery, because smokestack recovery is a way to get emissions down towards zero. But if you've already blown through 1.5 degrees, which we're going to do, may have done already, then stopping it doesn't help. You're over. It's too late. You've got to bail the boat and get it back floating again. And that requires direct air capture. So it's really important that we do this carbon capture technology work. It's the way in which we're going to help reduce smokestack emissions out of the power plant sector. There's going to be quarreling over it with the fossil fuel industry saying that it's not a developed technology, which is going to make me furious because they're the ones who refuse to develop it. It's like saying you should feel sorry for me that my baby drowned when you're the one who drowned the baby. It's like, you don't get sympathy for that. So.
I don't know about baby drowning analogies. It's
right.
mainly, I don't,
Another
I
one.
can think of a few others.
The
Yeah.
arsonist who burned his own house
Yeah,
down.
yeah, thank you.
We'll go to that.
Without the
We'll go to
children
that
inside, we're
instead.
good. Yeah.
But yeah, we've got to make sure that this steers in the right direction. And there's a very legitimate concern out of the environmental justice community that what happens is that we come in and we do direct air capture in fancy places where engineers want to work. And we offset that with the carbon emissions of polluting plants that are also dumping arsenic, everything else on communities around them. And they're looking around saying, wait a minute, how the hell does this help me? So that's why I think they're two separate focuses. One is on making sure that the environmental justice issues that we've let lapse for so long are forcefully addressed. And the second is making sure that we actually have the technology to not just go drive the planet off the cliff. And I would say, you know, at the end of the day, the best thing we can do for environmental justice is protect the planet. You drive your plane into the mountain and nobody cares very much whether you're in first class or coach. Fighting about whether you're in first class or coach is secondary to missing the mountain.
That's a great analogy. I like that one.
Okay, that was better.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay,
That one
no town
passed.
babies any longer.
Thank you.
A little fresh for Molly to be.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing,
town
actually.
baby.
So we received several questions about natural gas and wind, so
Sure.
technology penetration. I'll start with the wind. Actually, both of these reference items that you brought up in your remarks. So you come from a state, of course, with offshore wind
Yep.
potential, significant offshore wind potential. However, the offshore wind industry is facing many challenges due to higher than expected costs, as well as resistance. So the question is how to deal with NIMBYism of coastal populations towards offshore wind.
I think the first thing you have to do is kind of sort out what's real NIMBYism and what's fossil fuel front group NIMBYism. When Jim Inhofe staffer is off the coast, an Oklahoma senator is off the coast of Rhode Island holding up signs about whales, that's not NIMBYism. That's something completely different. We built in Rhode Island the first offshore wind turbines. And on Block Island, they're actually really proud of it. There was one guy who didn't like the light on the top of the turbines. And so we started working with the FAA to see if we get permission to build like a shield around the light. So if you're, because it's for aircraft.
Yeah.
So if you're flying over an aircraft, you see the red light flashing, but if you're him on his porch having his coffee at 5:30 in the morning, he doesn't see it. Constituent service, right? And I checked in with Block Island Power a couple, maybe 2 years ago and said, how are we doing, you know, with this guy? Please let him know that we're still pushing the FAA on this. And he said, oh yeah, I forgot to tell you. He called me up the other day. He says, you know, I don't really mind those lights. It's kind of nice. So there's like in real life where we actually did this on Block Island, it ain't NIMBY, it's the opposite.
Yeah.
And the fishing community loves the offshore wind turbines because they head out there because they know they can put their day boat customers onto fish. And the customers often think it's cool to go around and see the first offshore wind turbines in America. So it's been a big plus for the fishing fleet out of Block Island because they are doing day boat fishing as opposed to trawling. And indeed, the people who go out and deliver the workers to the wind turbines for maintenance and so forth, it's a ferry company. The guy who owns the company sent me a picture the other day of a juvenile great white shark swimming among the wind turbines. He wasn't sure he got the count right, but he thought there were 5 of them that day, which is a pretty good sign that the notion that stuff grows on the pilings and stuff comes to eat what grows on the pilings and stuff comes to eat what came to eat. And at the end of the day, you've got juvenile great white sharks thinking that this is a good place for a meal. That's not a bad signal about where real NIMBYism ends up once people see real results.
Yeah. So one on natural gas, do you support the decision to pause the permits for new LNG
100%.
facilities?
100%.
Tell us about it.
100%. The problem is that when you're comparing, let's say, coal to natural gas, the comparison takes place at the burner tip. So you're burning natural gas here to spin a turbine. You're burning coal here to spin a turbine. You compare the emissions from those two things, coal loses. Coal looks terrible. But if what you're burning is LNG, and if it started in Pennsylvania and had to come down a pipeline and then go to a massive facility where it was hyper pressurized and then be loaded onto a boat, which had to be powered and drive across the Atlantic, and then go to another huge facility where it had to be depressurized and then put back into a pipeline system. And you don't even know how much leakage is happening through that pipeline system, and nobody's adding up the energy burn of the whole operation. That US LNG is probably actually worse for the climate than local coal, which is weird. But that's the analysis they're looking for. And I'll add that the argument against it is, oh, wait a minute, we've got like Putin coming after Ukraine, threatening Europe with his petropolitics, trying to push down European economies. They desperately need this. This is a national security issue. I led the Senate delegation to the Munich Security Conference, and we didn't hear that once. That is just not the case. They've got other sources. They've dialed it down a lot. And there was zero mention of a national security need from the Germans, the Belgians, from NATO, from anybody about this. So I think this is more fossil fuel industry creation and less actual real national security concern.
Let's talk about natural gas facilities and specifically the Biden administration and the regulation of natural gas facilities. So the question is the Biden administration having cold feet when it comes to regulating natural gas power plants?
Well, I criticized them pretty harshly for the decision to leave existing natural gas plants out of the Clean Power Plant rule. There are basically three categories of electric power plant. One is existing coal plants. Ain't gonna be no new ones. They're all dying out. There's existing natural gas. And then there's gas plants that are in design and, coming online. They only applied their regulation to the dying coal fleet and the not present and therefore not emitting natural gas emerging fleet. The existing natural gas fleet, which produces now most of the power plant sector's emissions, they just didn't bother to apply the rule to them.
Postpone the decision, right?
They're going to start a whole new rulemaking. So I found that whole thing very frustrating and hard to explain. And I think it was a big flub by EPA. I suspect they somewhere thought that they were buying some peace from the natural gas industry by only saying you've got to fix your plants that are still in design. But I don't think you ever actually buy peace with the fossil fuel industry. I think they tell you that they're going to be really mad at you if you do something, and then if you go ahead and pay attention to them, they're just as mad as they ever were, and they behave just as badly, and all their front groups are just as wicked, and the money pours just as evilly into the political system, and nothing really changes. So to me, there's no upside to trying to make nice with polluters who behave the way this particular set of polluters behaves.
We have time for one more. It'll
Sure.
be short.
Sorry about that unpleasant remark, but I've had a lot of experience dealing with them. It is not founded in mere opinion.
Last question is, should Congress enact legislation to ban the construction of new properties in coastal areas that have been identified as flooding areas?
That's not the way I would go about it. And you may even get into, takings issues and things like that, the constitutional takings problems. What I think we must do is change the flood insurance program so that there is an owner-chosen option to get out. For a long time, the flood insurance program required you to rebuild in place, and it required you to rebuild the same thing in place, which made sense if you didn't want somebody building a mansion where a hut was on the federal nickel. But it doesn't make sense when you're going to have to put it up 14 feet in order to miss the storms, and now you can't pay to put it up 14 feet. So
What they will do is allow you to take the check and leave. But only if the municipality has said, this is an abandonment zone.
Mhm.
I have yet to find a municipality that's happy to say, this is an abandonment zone. So you're asking the wrong people to make a decision they don't want to make. And it just is,
Best interest,
yeah,
right?
they've got every interest in not doing that. What you want is the person whose house got flooded to be able to say, okay, we're here from FEMA, we're here from the National Flood Insurance Program. You can do one of two things. We can help you rebuild and you can stay where you are, or we can give you a check and you're out of here. You can build wherever you want.
Mhm.
You can potentially even keep that piece of property so that you can go there and put a tent up or hang out and have a picnic, but you can't build there. And the property has to go under easement so that you can't sell it to somebody else who then builds into it.
Mhm.
And I believe because the cost of the federal flood insurance program is so high for these multiple claims properties, that if you could take that out, you could actually say to the owner, not only that, but you'll get a bonus for not rebuilding there. And that makes it the owner's decision, which is where you want the decision to lie. The decision is happening at the moment of decision. Do you rebuild or do you not? And you have the opportunity to create what is then, either private or public open space behind it. But it's driven by individual choices.
Mhm.
Otherwise, I think you get into a lot of blowback and a lot of people who think they've been treated unfairly. And you end up devolving into a very bad place if you don't leave it
Mhm.
at the property owner's decision.
Right, and aligning the incentives and removing the disincentives that are
Exactly.
confronting them.
So that's my plan for whenever we get the NFIP redone.
Thank you. So I have the pleasure of also closing out this session today. I have a few things to tell you, but first I would like to take the moment to acknowledge and give our huge appreciation to Senator Whitehouse for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
A few other notes. Thank you all in the room for joining us for this event. We're so thankful that you came out. This was our last Energy Week event that we had, and it's been such a great week of high energy events all over campus. And I would like to also give a few other notes of appreciation. I would like to acknowledge the incredible work of the Kleinman Center staff for all of their hard work this week and last week and the weeks before. They've just poured an incredible amount of heart and focus into these events. And staff, yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Applause line, right?
I appreciate that. Thank you. And staff all across the university who have really supported Energy Week in so many ways. I'd also like to take a moment to celebrate the fantastic partnership between the Kleinman Center and the Vagelos Institute, and to note how lucky we are here at Penn to have such phenomenal centers of science and technology and policy all here on our campus. So that's just wonderful. And I think we should cut to that as well. And then just a few housekeeping items for everybody. So the first, we are adding recordings of so many of the events that you saw this week onto the Kleinman Center website. So feel free to go there and check them out in coming days. Lunch is being served just right outside of the door. So as you exit, you will find boxes there. And then last, I'm going to ask if you could kindly remain in your seats. I am going to escort the senator off to his next event before everybody else gets up and leaves. So with that, we'll take off.
Off we
Thank
go.
you all.
Thank you.